Hey guys, it's Robert and Gus. We are here to do the debrief on our latest Return to Ravnica draft. This time we wound up playing Rakdos, but a somewhat more unconventional Rakdos deck than you typically see. Most Rakdos decks are very heavily focused on aggro and early drops, which we would have played if we'd gotten the cards passed to us, but we didn't see some of the cards you typically want, especially some Gorehouse Chainwalkers and Splatter Thugs and all those early drops. So we wound up playing something that's a little bit more of an aggro control deck, and I'll let Robert tell you what that means.
Aggro control, like our Is It deck the week before, is more about putting threats down to cause your opponents to respond to them, putting pressure on them so that we could put down the Lobber Crews and grind them out while they're taking care of the other things. At some points in some of our games, our opponents actually take out creatures instead of Lobber Crews, and the Lobber Crews are what kill them.
We are able to get enough multicolored cards to get, and we have 2 Lobber Crews, that in a number of cases we are able to just stack up huge amounts of damage off of Lobber Crews and then burn out our opponents with a Hellhole Flailer. Unfortunately, some of the cards that we really want for this deck archetype we didn't get, specifically the Annihilating Fires and the Explosive Impacts. We never saw them. We didn't get a crack at them. This archetype works best when you can get a little early pressure, control the board a little bit with some removals, and then finish the game out with the reach from something like Lobber Crews, Burn, or Stab Wounds. So I think now we will go ahead and take a look at some of our individual picks. So in Pack 1, Pick 1, we get a chance to take an Ash Zealot, which is actually a pretty good card for these Rakdos decks, but surprisingly enough, the Stab Wound is generally a better card because after you get past the first couple of turns, oftentimes a 2/2 just gets blocked by something like in Towering Indrik, but the Stab Wound is able to continue to generate damage along into the endgame.
The other thing about that is this is a first pick. We don't know we're playing Rakdos aggro control until we're later in. Obviously, if we know that beforehand, maybe we do take the Ash Zealot. But as you hear us in the original, we're talking about the Stab Wound and the Slime Molding, because as first picks go, those leave you open for more deck types, and you don't know what's coming downstream yet.
Yeah, and as it turns out, since we were playing more of a controlling kind of deck, grindy deck, the Ash Zealot actually wouldn't have been as good in our deck as it would have been in a traditional Rakdos aggro deck that has, 2 or 3 Chainwalkers and a couple of Splatter Thugs, and the Dread Reveler that we have to pass here. This was actually, I think, our only shot at a Dread Reveler, but it's obviously not as good as Stab Wound, in part probably because passing a Dread Reveler and an Ash Zealot put somebody downstream into Rakdos.
Most of the decisions we make up to this point in the deck, in the draft, were in our original pack, and most of our picks up until now have been fairly obvious. We don't need to tell you much about them. But if you look at this pack, you see there is a Courser's Accord, Druid's Deliverance, Swift Justice, and Fencing Ace in it. 4 cards that all Selesnya players want. They took the Slime Molding and nothing else.
You generally would not expect to see these cards wheel, especially the Fencing Ace. The Druid's Deliverance is a lower pick that's only, not for all Selesnya decks, but particularly for Populate decks. But to see all of these in the same pack wheel is extremely unusual. But at the same time, we actually wound up facing, 2 Selesnya decks?
Yeah, 2. The last guy was sort of
some multicolor monstrosity.
Yeah. We'll get to that.
But at any rate, this is highly unusual. And as it turns out, the very next pack also has a Fencing Ace. 2 Fencing Aces. Passed all the way around the table, which we wind up hate drafting, thankfully. But you should not expect to see behavior like this in the drafts that you do at home or at your game store or on MTGO.
Also, the Selesnya Sentry probably shouldn't still be in there. The Horncaller's Chant, that's a late pick if you get it at all, but still, 3 good Selesnya, 3 cards that'll make it into a Selesnya deck in here.
We are extremely fortunate here for our 13th pick to have a Slitherhead wheel all the way around to us. Slitherhead is one of those cards that, again, is very situational, like a lot of 1-drops. But in our deck, trying to be an aggressive deck, although it turns out we are a little bit more aggro control by the time we get to the end, we don't know that entirely yet. Having the 1-drops, especially ones you don't mind throwing away, are excellent for putting, say, Deviant Glee on to just attack very aggressively early on. And the scavenging ability to, say, pump the Hellhole Flailer for extra damage is very relevant. And also, as we fail to mention later in the draft, when we have more shots at Slitherhead, and maybe should have taken them a bit more aggressively, is they untap Lobber Crews because they're multicolored.
Yeah, upon reflection, we should have taken almost all the Slitherheads we saw after this. And the fact that this one is in here is an aberration. It shouldn't still be there. It's good enough that somebody should have taken it before 13. But hey, we're happy with it.
We talk a lot about hate drafting and how we like to hate draft fairly aggressively. One aspect of hate drafting is identifying cards that your deck is going to have a difficult time beating or will just somehow wind up overpowering you. When you get past a pack that has very little of value for the deck that you are building, or at least you think you're building, then one of the things you look at is the power level of all the rest of the cards and which is the best card and which is the hardest one to beat. Oftentimes, once you hate draft a bunch of really powerful cards, sometimes you find that the deck you want to build is a different color because your most powerful cards are things that you hate drafted, and you wind up shifting colors. And in a way, hate drafting can be related to reading signals because you're picking up powerful cards maybe when you shouldn't. This is, for us, unfortunate on this pick because we are only on the second pick, and there's just not much for us in this pack. It's not really, at this point, being able to read a signal. The fact that there's not many good cards for us in this pack just means this pack had no good cards for us when it was opened initially. In this pack, we wind up taking another Sewer Shambler, which is a fine card. It's reasonably good. And it was between that or the Viashino Racketeer, which we felt we didn't need a second copy of. But the most powerful card in this pack, and the one that's most likely to wind up overpowering you, is an actually seemingly innocuous card. It's the Axebane Guardian. In the original discussion, we glossed over the Axebane a little bit, but we've passed a number of Gatecreeper Vines, and obviously those allow for a lot of mana ramp, and it turns out that in round 3 we actually lose to the Axebane Guardian Defender deck, which is able to ramp out a lot of mana and be dropping Risen Sanctuaries on turn 4 or 5 and playing all kinds of colors to splash for everything that they need. Having lots of Axebane Guardians does empower a lot of powerful shenanigans, and sometimes if you are, especially an aggressive deck focused on the early game, your opponent being able to ramp out big threats early, you just can't deal with them because your deck's not designed to be able to do that. And it was probably better for us to take the Axebane Guardian. We also do have we wind up in the end with a number of green cards, and it's possible we could have played Jund.
The other thing that Axebane Guardian does is it rewards somebody who doesn't have a focus by giving them a way of making their not focused deck work. And we should have seen that most of the other players in this pod are not focused, and we should have taken away their unfocused enabler.
In this pack, we don't mention at all that there is a Psychic Spiral here because blue is obviously way too far of a stretch for any mana base we might have, even for a sideboard card. The only thing that Psychic Spiral is really relevant for is defense against the mill deck, and we do wind up facing in the finals the Defender deck, which he actually does have at least one, or we don't know how many Doorkeepers had, but he had at least one. And Psychic Spiral can occasionally be a relevant card when you've seen a bunch of Defenders, the Axebane Guardians and the Gatecreeper Vines and the Doorkeepers and the Hover Barriers. We've seen a lot of good Defender cards go by to potentially enable that. And so picking up a Psychic Spiral, you generally wouldn't want to be doing it here at this third pick, but it's something to pay attention to.
And here we are later on in Booster Pack 2. We have a shot at Dark Revenant, and our deck actually ends up very light against flyers. One part because of the client itself, but mostly just because there are no good flyers at common in black and red. There's the Daggerdrome Imp at common, and that's it. So black has to be much more conscious of taking flyers and flying defense, and we ended up really light on most of the targeted control that this deck needs. We end up taking Golgari Longlegs, and the other problem with that is we have shots at other big creatures later on, and so it just ends up being sort of vanilla for us.
So Golgari Longlegs is good for what we were doing and what we were thinking. It's a good beater, it's efficient for its cost, and because it's multicolor, it interacts very well with the Lobber Cruise, which at this point we now have our second one, which is largely why I pushed for it, not really thinking about the fact that we were going to be weak against flyers. But Robert's right. You will, as it turns out, we have shots at Spawn of Rixmati and some other things later on, and Golgari Longlegs is generally fairly replaceable in a deck like this. I would also mention that here we see another Doorkeeper going by, and it's important to be aware of the Defender.deck with the Axebane Guardians and the Gatecreeper Vines that we have already passed.
Here, there's nothing really for us. Terrace Worm is not going to help us very much, and we hate the Savage Surge pump over the Risen Sanctuary due to the fact that the Savage Surge is more playable. But the fact that we've already passed Axebane Guardian and none of the defenders are coming back around means we should have paid more attention to the Risen Sanctuaries.
The Axebane Guardians enable many bombs that are sometimes overcosted, and you think you're playing an aggressive deck, and so the expensive 7-drop is not going to be relevant to whether you win or lose the game. But that calculation can change a little bit when the other guy has a bunch of Axebane Guardians. So it's not necessarily that we made the wrong pick here, but in our original discussion, we didn't talk about the potential mana ramp into the fatty.
And here in Pack 3, our second pick, we incorrectly state that there is nothing for our deck in here, whereas Slitherhead, the one we already have, is fine for our deck. This second one would have been even better. We hate Seller of Songbirds after we've already talked about how bad the populate players in this pod are drafting. We don't want to give them a chance to correct that, but that's still not the right call.
Yeah, at this point, knowing now that we have 2 Lobber Crews changes the equation a little bit. Just the value of a cheap multicolor spell just for some extra damage when we're grinding people out and we want a chump blocker can be very effective. Additionally, the hate drafting, the Seller of Songbirds, is not the worst choice out of here. We thought, again, that the Void Wielder was probably, we didn't have tokens, we had some, for the deck that we were playing, we didn't think that the Void Wielder was going to be really good against us. The problem, as it turned out, again, was the mana ramp with the Axebane Guardians, and there's another Gatecreeper Vine in here that probably goes to the guy doing the Defender.deck. So if we were going to hate something, it might have actually been better for us to hate the Void Wielder, which in a vacuum is the better card than the Seller of Songbirds, but it just seemed at the time that we were more concerned about the Selesnya populate decks, and the original choice was not bad or wrong. Our original logic was not incorrect, but the other choices were probably better.
And this is the pick where the client screws us. The Daggerdrome Imp is highlighted. It is clearly picked. The mouse does go over the Spawn of Rixmati, but there is no click. The border doesn't change. You can go back and listen to it as many times as you want. It's not there. It just decides to give us the wrong card. Also of note, the 4th Risen Sanctuary.
I think I owe Robert an apology here. I kept accusing him of accidentally clicking on the Spawn of Rixmati, but upon further review, Robert was right all along. It was just the client screwed us up. He did, in fact, try and take the Daggerdrome Imp. Sorry, Robert.
Thank you, Gus. And here the Slitherhead we didn't take the first time comes back around, and for some odd reason we decided to hate Swift Justice. At the time, we are talking about possibly playing 3 colors with white, but just having Slitherhead and in 2 colors is so much better, and we just ignored it again.
I do want to say we also were thinking about the lifelink from Swift Justice, and if you are playing a Rakdos aggro deck, that you don't want to let them gain life, because you generally tend to peter out when you get to the late game, and letting them gain life and last a little bit longer is usually very bad for your game plan. We did not, I think, correctly realize until we actually built the deck at the end that we had a aggro control deck rather than just a pure aggro deck. And some of our choices were probably colored a little bit, thinking that we were more of a straight aggro deck than an aggro control deck.
We're superstars now. Shh, don't talk to us.
So by the time we get to the end of the draft, we have a pretty decent Rakdos deck. It is a deck that I would pick to probably go about 2-1, just as it turned out. It would be a deck that I would pick to go 3-0 if we'd had about 2 more burn spells or removal spells. If we'd gotten another Augur Spree, Annihilating Fire, or especially an Explosive Impact, then this deck would have been a lot better. But it's definitely solid the way it worked out. The fact that we're missing the Slitherhead that we failed to pick up even the second time around, it makes a little bit of difference. Most decks generally wouldn't want to play 2 Slitherheads anyways. The main reason why we would have is just for triggering our Labra Cruise or potentially pumping a Hellhole Flailer.
We are heavy on the 3-drop slot, so if we had picked up the second one, it would have been instead of 3 Sewer Shamblers.
So overall, it was I think we did pretty good with what we were given. Most of the mistakes we made were in some of the hate drafts that we chose, maybe hate drafting something slightly differently based on what we'd seen go by, and those came back to bite us a little bit in the finals, along with some of our play mistakes that we made in round 3. So we will be going over what we did during the actual games here, so we'll be back in a minute. Thanks for watching.